I'm glad you didn't sing all the verses. I probably would have developed a Class 3 leak by the time you were done. So the title of my talk today is State of Independence. And you might think that I would go off and start talking about the United States and, maybe what kind of a nation we are. But actually, that title refers to a song, which we're not going to do today. But it's an old Anderson and Vangelis tune from the album Friends of Mr. Cairo. And my relationship with that song began back in 1981. I was directing a play at West Virginia University. I started directing when I was an undergraduate. And we were doing When You Coming Back, Red Ryder by Mark Medoff, which is an extremely challenging play. And one of the highlights of my career as a director. And my best friend Steve was not only playing one of the leads, who happened to be named Steve in the play, he was also the scenic lighting and sound designer. And in putting together the music that was going to be played, before the show, and a couple of songs that happened during the show, and then the songs at the end, he brought me the tape and he was playing stuff for me, and he said, "Now this is the song I want to do, after we do the curtain call, so that when everybody, is walking out and milling around, this is what they hear." And it was State of Independence. And he said, and the reason for this is, he said, I have this vision of Stephen and Teddy. Teddy was the bad guy, but as I kind of explain the metaphysics of the plot line, you'll come to see he really represents something very different. But he says, I kind of see Stephen and Teddy maybe running into each other several years after this play happened and just seeing each other and giving each other a high five. And that's the feeling that this song, State of Independence, gives me. And I said, perfect. And that's what we went with. So to kind of fill you in on the story, When You Coming Back, Red Ryder, did anybody see the not very good movie that was made from it with Marjo Gortner and Peter Firth? Okay, so yeah, it was not so good. And they sort of Hollywooded the ending of it. They added an ending that was not in the play. But the action of the play takes place in a small diner in New Mexico, near the Mexican border. And what happens is that on this particular morning, a couple comes into the diner, and the guy, Teddy, is in the process of smuggling some drugs across the Mexican border, and their van has broken down, and he doesn't have any money to get it fixed. So he takes everyone in the diner hostage, and he coerces the town mechanic into fixing his van while he holds these people hostage. And at the end of the play, he rides off in his fixed-up van, full of drugs to go who knows where. During the course of the time that he holds these people hostage, Teddy goes into their psyches, and he challenges each one of them to see some truths about themselves that they would rather not look at. Now, in the case of Stephen, the character my best friend Steve played, Stephen is the kid who works the night shift in the diner. And he has these big dreams of going off somewhere and coming back someday in a Chevrolet Corvette Stingray convertible the color of money, as he says in the play. But he's not going anywhere, He stays in that town, and he's sort of attached to his job and his little job at the diner and his dreams. And in so many ways, each of those people in that play was dependent on one thing or another. And as Teddy gets to know them and sees how they react to being under stress, he shows them what it is they are dependent on. And he reveals to them some truths about themselves that they may not have wanted to know. Angel, who is the kind of the day shift cook, she's written to be very overweight. And she is dependent on food to give her the love that she is not getting in her life from Steve. As it turns out, she happens to be in love with Stephen. And then there's Lyle Stryker, the mechanic, who is actually in love with Angel. And he gets by on, some of his dreams and he comes in and simply eats pie because that's what he can get out of the diner. There's a couple that is in the diner when they're taken hostage, and they are very much dependent on the illusions they have about their marriage to one another. They are also dependent on her Stradivarius violin, which is one of the means that Teddy uses to cow them. He threatens to break that. As he points out, they are also in thrall essentially to their ideas of what their marriage is, as much as they are in thrall to keeping that old piece of wood in one piece. And so as the action of the play goes forward, one by one, he kind of takes them all down. But he is not merely trying to belittle or dismiss them. What he is trying to do is to awaken them to the possibilities of what truth can mean in their lives. At one point, he says to Stephen, "Rise to the occasion, boy. Rise to it. Rise to it." And that is essentially the message that he has for everyone that is in that diner. All these people who are dependent on their illusions and their attachments. And so, at the very end of the play, after he has duct taped everyone up and ridden off into the sunrise, when the owner of the diner comes in and frees them all, Stephen, rather than simply going home and going to bed to come back to the diner one more night, asks the couple with the violin if he can have a ride with them out of town. They were on their way to New Orleans, and he says, "Can I go to New Orleans with you?" So at the end of the play, that villain had actually gotten him to rise to the occasion, to let go of his dependence on that safe lifestyle that he knew, and to reach out for the freedom, even though it's a little dangerous, of what is out there in that wide open world in front of him. I don't know if Mark Medoff, who's the playwright, would agree with me if I compare Teddy to the Christ consciousness in us. Some people might be offended by the fact that I'm comparing Christ to a long-haired, hostage-taking drug smuggler. And what he really represents in that play is very much like that Christ of us that speaks to us, challenging us, attempting to pull us out of our dependencies and our illusions. When we go back in Scripture to Exodus and we look at the Israelites coming out of Egypt, Charles Fillmore, one of Unity's co-founders, talks about Egypt as metaphysically representing the flesh consciousness, the sense consciousness. So it is that removal of ourselves from that sense consciousness where we may be held captive or held in thrall that allows us to come to the promised land. But just like it happened in Exodus, there are some people who are going to come kicking and screaming. Now, some of us may not have read the entire book, but not everybody, not all of the Israelites were really happy about the decision to leave Egypt, even though they had been slaves, and run off into the desert to look for this place Moses kept telling them about. At several points during the journey, the Bible says that they complained, and not just that they complained, but they complained bitterly. And many of them wanted to turn around and go back. Can you imagine that? Wanting to go back into slavery. Just because you would know where your next meal was coming from. That seems awfully strange to us today. Maybe. We sometimes wonder why largely women, but women and men, stay in abusive relationships. I remember my mother being so sore some mornings about all she could do was sit in a hot bathtub. But she stayed for a long time. Because what she knew was less frightening than the unknown of how am I going to put a roof over my kids' heads? How am I going to feed my kids? And there are so many of us who hang on to so many material things, those things of the sense consciousness, those things of Egypt, rather than releasing them and moving into the promised land. Any of us who have ever dealt with addiction, myself included, right, know exactly what that's all about. I can't tell you how many times I would find myself drunk again and say, that was not what I wanted. How did I get here? But, oh well, now that I'm here, I might as well have another and another and another. It is so easy for us to get caught up in the illusions that our mind wants to sell us, that our egos want to sell us. It's interesting in that story in Exodus. So the people are complaining so much. Moses finally has to go to God and say, hey, God, I think I'm going to have a revolt here. We're going to have to come up with some food, some water, something. And of course, you may know the story about him striking the rock with his staff and creating water, or about God providing manna, which was something that the people could collect and eat. Now, interesting thing about manna was it had really low shelf life, right? The manna that was good today would not be good tomorrow. You had to trust that what you got today was going to be for today, and that tomorrow you were going to be taken care of. And that is it's a key concept in understanding the kind of consciousness that Jesus taught us. That it's not about the material, but rather about the spiritual. At the beginning of his ministry, again, it's interesting how we watch that growth in consciousness from the beginning of the Hebrew scriptures and then into the Christian scriptures. Obviously the Israelites were having a real tough time letting go of all the things that they were attached to, all the things they were dependent on early on. And they kept needing reminders over and over and over again. Time and time again, they would backslide. They would sometimes create idols. You've all heard of the golden calf. That wasn't the only one. They did a lot of crazy stuff in all the time that it took them to get from Egypt to the promised land. Now, what's interesting is that this is all a parabolic story arc. As someone pointed out, it actually takes about 2 weeks to walk that distance. So the whole 40 years thing, it's allegorical. But it's that journey in consciousness that we're talking about. So when the Christian scriptures begin, right after Jesus is baptized, there's, the time that he spends in the desert. Again, that time in the desert where we're tested. And in the story that is told of him, he is tempted by Satan. Okay? Now, again, we're in unity, so we're going to talk about this metaphysically. Satan represents our sense consciousness. All right? Even one of the stories about Jesus, one of his childhood stories, has him going back to Egypt. One of the birth stories has Joseph taking the infant Jesus back to Egypt so that he can come out of Egypt as well. Anyway, Satan shows up to test Jesus, and what does he test him with? Those things of the sense consciousness that we tend to become dependent on. The first thing is, he's like, obviously you're starving to death. You've been out here wandering around for 40 days. Hey, why don't you just turn some of those rocks into bread and you're going to be fine, Have a big old meal. And, of course, Jesus responds with, it's not by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God that we are fed. And that's an important lesson. Again, it's not about our attachment to something physical. And he's tested with, the view from the mountaintop. Here, if you'll just bow down and worship me, I'll give you all this stuff. What an ego-fulfilling thing it would be to know that everyone worships you. One of those illusions that we tell ourselves is that we can get control over everything. Whether it's about the adulation or simply about the ability to say, I'm in charge here. I one time figured out that all those of us who are addicted to something are really control freaks at the bottom end of it, because what we're trying to do is control how we feel in the moment. Whether we're doing it with, booze or drugs or shopping or food or sex or whatever it is, it's really about control. And then finally, when Satan takes him up to the top of the temple and says, hey, you could just jump off, and if you're the real deal, God's angels are going to save you. And Jesus says, don't tempt the Lord your God. Don't tempt the universe. How do we keep from harming ourselves? We don't do stupid stuff we know we shouldn't be doing. All right? Have I done stupid stuff I knew I shouldn't be doing? Yes. And thankfully, once or twice the angels were there to catch me. And there are a couple times when I hit bottom. But the point is that what Jesus was, the point he was making as he was doing all those things is saying it is not the things you think are important. Those things you are depending on. The idea of safety, the simple idea of physical satiation, the idea that you can be in control, those are all illusions. And all of the good that comes to us comes through God. There is no one source for any of it. It's not just up to me to create my own bread. If I'm doing what I ought to be doing, manna's going to show up from heaven. It may not be enough to stack up a whole great big pile and retire on, but I'll have food today. Today I'll be all right. I'll have enough. And I may not have the whole world kneeling at my feet. I may not have any of it. Right? I just know my part in the universe. I do my part. And that's enough. I can let go of my ego's desire, of that illusion that it wants me to be dependent on, so that it can drive me in a different direction than my soul really wants to take me, than the Christ of me really wants to go. I love how the play ends with Stephen out the door and then Angel on stage all alone. And as the lights are dimming down, she goes over to where Stephen had been sitting, and there was half a donut he had left on a plate, and she reaches over and she picks up the donut and puts it in her mouth. It becomes so clear what our choices are. Do we let go of those things that we are dependent on, that we have allowed to seduce us into a life that does not serve our highest good? Or do we move out? And do we actually have the bravery to say, I'm going to let go of this stuff. I'm going to live in a different state? Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was the leader of the American Transcendentalists, he had been a Unitarian minister and was no longer satisfied with the teachings of American Protestantism or Unitarianism. He went over to Europe and he started learning from some of the German Transcendentalists over there. When he came back, he wrote and said some extremely important things that actually helped form all of the New Thought movement. But one of the things that he said that was most critical to what we do and what we believe is that we are no longer dependent upon an idea of a God outside us or the idea of a church that is going to serve as the intermediary to that God. Because what we have is spiritual independence. And that's the same thing that Jesus was trying to teach us all along when he said, the Father and I are one. You know, I do nothing but through the Father. Each and every one of us has the power of divinity in us. We don't need to depend on any one job for our abundance. We don't even need to depend on any one career path for our abundance. I take a look at my life, and I'm a great example of that. But there are so many people that I see around the country and around the world now who are laying aside those jobs that they've been doing for so long because they think they're stuck there trying to keep a roof over their house and feed their kids. And they're beginning to do things that they are passionate about. In a speech that he gave at a graduation, Jim Carrey, the actor, talks about this. And he talks about his father and said that although his father had a lot of the same talents and a lot of the same desires that Jim had, he became an accountant because that was safe. He could depend on that. And what ended up happening was fairly late in his life, his father was laid off. And the lesson Jim said he learned from that is it's possible to fail at a job that you hate. So you might as well be doing what you're really called to do. And that is such great advice to each and every one of us because truly our dependence on anything of this world, whether it is a job or a spouse or anything, is really just an illusion. The truth is that our independence is our birthright from our divine nature, from God, that Father, Mother, Creator being that lives through us and moves through us and has our being. So now I sometimes wonder at what it would mean for that visual image of Teddy and Stephen, is that my Christ nature and my human nature or my sense consciousness finally getting together, finally when I have let go of the things that I need to let go of, and I have embraced what I'm here to do and who I am here to become, and I've just managed to get rid of all the illusions that I was dependent on before. At some point down the road, will they come together and give each other a high five? Because I've found that state of independence, that state where the Christ of me lives me every day. This week, I invite all of you to look within and find any unhealthy dependencies that may exist. I know that it will be scary to consider letting them go. But all I can offer you is freedom, a state of independence. Have a wonderful week.